Hi, this is Jacob again, making another video on Samoan grammar and Samoan language. Again, just a really quick recap. I'm trying to make these videos that'll cover little bits and pieces of Samoan grammar. So for those that are interested in learning Samoan, in particular, I was thinking people that are probably more of Samoan heritage or they have Samoans in their family that they'd like to communicate better with. I'm creating these from someone who speaks from a native English speaking perspective. So, um, a lot of people that learn Samoan as kids, they didn't have to learn all the grammar and all that other stuff. But if you're coming from an English speaking background, sometimes it's helpful to have these more formal kind of rules just to kind of help you get a grasp of everything that you're hearing and the way that maybe a native speaker might describe why they say the things the way they say it. So again, quick background. I served as a missionary in Samoa when I was younger, like when I'm 19 and 20. And I didn't know any Samoan when I first started. And I came away learning, being able to speak Samoan. And then I taught it for a few years after coming home. So I thought I'd try and make these videos and just, see if they're helpful to anyone else. So again, if this is the first video you're seeing of mine, I would highly encourage you to go back and maybe start at the beginning of the playlist that I've got, which I'll link above, and just start from the very beginning where I'll cover everything from just pronouncing different sounds in the Samoan language and the alphabet, all the way to the lesson that we're talking about today, which is around perfecting verbs and transitive sentence structure, which sounds pretty advanced. I'll try and make it accessible and not try and spend too much time on the nitty-gritty details, but hopefully just give you enough to sort of get your bearings and figure out how to apply this when you're speaking as well as when you're trying to understand others. So with that being said, again, kind of lesson topics today. We're going to talk about how to perfect verbs and what even perfecting a verb really means and why we would do it. I'm going to talk about transitive sentence structure and how that relates to perfected verbs. And then, as always, with every lesson I do, I may not have a great activity for you, but I highly encourage you to practice this. So, feel free to obviously pause and go back to other videos or do whatever you need to do when you're watching these things. But it won't really do you much good if you don't try and put this into practice. So hopefully you've got someone, in your family or your friend network or wherever where you can actually practice Samoan, and maybe they're native speakers or maybe they're learning along with you. Even if they're learning along with you, it's not a bad idea, and they're still going to be really helpful just in you guys going back and forth and kind of, again, trying to use this as best as you can. It's the only way to get it. All right, with that said, perfective verbs. So really what a perfective verb is as opposed to an imperfective or imperfect verb, it's an aspect of a verb, and really what it is, it's considering that verb or that action in its totality as opposed to kind of like a snippet or a point in time. And so the English example that I have here is really looking at the perfective and the imperfective aspect of the verb to read. And depending on what tense we're using it, we can conjugate it to have read. But anyway, the imperfective aspect would be demonstrated in this sentence. I will read the book. So the tense that we have here is future tense. Read is obviously our verb here, and it's hard to tell without contrasting it with the perfective, but the imperfective version is really just a snapshot in time. I will read the book. The perfective aspect would be I will have read the book. And it's subtle. They're both in the future tense, but this have read, this modification we've done in English, what that's helping us do, it's considering that verb in its totality, and it's basically considering it as the verb having started, having taken place, and now it's finished. So it's the complete action. That's what the aspect of perfective means. It's considering the verb again in its totality of it taking place. So that's what I will have read the book. And the reason I used a future tense sentence here is to demonstrate that perfective versus imperfective has nothing to do with tense, but it has to do with, again, the totality of the verb and its consideration. This is really subtle. You guys can probably actually look for, English grammar lessons that'll describe this perfective versus imperfective concept better. But But in a nutshell, that's kind of what it means. It's just considering the verb in its totality. So look at the difference between those two sentences. The difference there is the difference between imperfective and perfective. So with that being said, this occurs in Samoan as well. And most commonly, the way that we sort of affect that change in aspect of the verb is by adding a suffix to a verb. And I'll give some examples, but the most common way of sort of perfecting a Samoan verb is by adding the suffix ina or a to the end of the verb. And there's not like a hard and fast rule, but for the most part, a verb takes either one or the other suffix. There's some cases where they could take either. And then there's also cases where there's a different suffix altogether that's applied. In all cases, when you're perfecting a verb, you're going to be adding a suffix. And I'll just take a quick second to pause here and say, hey, perfecting and imperfecting verbs, it's really subtle. And I wouldn't stress about it when you're speaking. Most of the time, people are going to get exactly what you're talking about, even if you don't use the perfective form of that verb, and you should have. It's not going to be that noticeable. The reason why I think it's valuable for a Samoan language learner is because you hear this all the time, and it might throw you off being like, oh my gosh, what's that new verb? Or, what did they say? When you just cut off the suffix, you might say, oh, wait, I know that verb. Okay, they're just using the perfective form of it, not a big deal. It doesn't change the meaning of what they said that much. There are certain verbs where if you use the perfective form, it actually does change the meaning, not wildly, but it does change the meaning. And I'll kind of highlight maybe an example or two of that. But I don't want you to freak out about this. It's subtle. It's more important for your comprehension than it is for you communicating. You're going to be able to get your point across even if you never use a perfective verb, but it might throw you off if you hear somebody else using a perfective verb and you feel like, that's a new word. I've never heard it before. When in reality, you actually have heard it before. They're just putting a suffix on there. Sounds a little fancier. It's technically correct, more correct. That's all. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. I wouldn't stress about this except for just knowing when to recognizing it and not to get hung up on it. So anyway, that being said, like I said, most verbs in Samoan, you add an ina or an a to the end of it, and that's what makes it perfective. So as an example, faitau. Faitau is to read in Samoan. Faitauina is the perfective form of faitau. Tali. Tali in Samoan is the verb to answer or to reply, or in some cases to, well, it is to answer and to reply. The perfective form of that is talia. Now, this is one case where the meaning of the verb changes just slightly by perfecting it. So tali can usually be thought of in English as to answer, to reply to like a question or something like that, or in some cases to a guest's request. And then talia can sometimes be thought of as to accept. And the reason that's there is because actually this concept of talia in Samoan, it is related to this concept of answering or replying. And think of it this way: you can accept guests into your home, and when you do that, you talia them. But in reality, what that kind of translates back to is back in the day when visitors from other villages would come with their sort of traveling party. They would basically be almost requesting sort of an audience, and you would respond to them, meaning you would talia them, you would invite them in, and that was kind of your way of responding to their request. So it's a little bit nuanced. Again, it's still just the perfective form of that verb. In English today, we would translate them to be different words, but there's some history and etymology to that. So don't get hung up on that. There actually is a reason for some of these things that are a little bit tweaked, and there's not tons of those kind of instances. But even so, it's still related, even though it may not seem like it in the very beginning. Okay, sorry, I kind of digress on that. Moving on, fa'amatala. Fa'amatala is the Samoan verb to explain. Fa'amatalaina is the perfective form of that. Soli is the Samoan word for to kind of crush or to tread or trespass. And then solia is again the perfective form of that. So you can kind of see how a and ina are added to verbs to make them perfective or to affect that perfective aspect. There's some irregular verbs in Samoan that just take on a different suffix, and there's not a hard and fast rule on these either. But for example, alofa. One clue here is alofa already ends in a, so you kind of know that it's not going to take on the a suffix because that'd be kind of weird. Alofa a. So you'd think at best it would take on alofaina, and to be honest, if you said that, I think people would still understand you. But in reality, the proper form of perfecting alofa is with the suffix nia, G-I-A. So it's alofania. Again, slight variation. To be honest, like you'd probably still pick up on it. Tautala is actually the same way. Tautala is the Samoan verb to speak. The perfective form of it is tautalania. Tautalania. Anyway, there might be other verbs there. I mean, it's hard to make an exhaustive list. But again, I just wanted to kind of make you aware. By far, the most common is by adding the suffix ina and a. Sometimes you might add a slightly different suffix. And alofa and tautala, agnia, and those are just two examples. So anyway, hopefully that's clear. Again, always please leave a comment. I do look at those things. I try my best to answer them. All right, so now where these perfective verbs kind of come into helping us speak better is the fact that most perfective verbs are also transitive in nature. And this is, again, another kind of English concept. I'm not like an English expert in terms of grammar and everything. So definitely you can look up these concepts in English if you need a little bit more guidance and a little bit more help. But basically, to kind of cut to the chase, an imperfective verb in Samoan is most often an intransitive verb. And what that really means, at least in my speak, is for an intransitive verb, you need a preposition to connect the verb to an object. And I'll give you examples of what this means. So intransitive, you need a preposition. For transitive verbs, you don't actually need a preposition because the verb itself is kind of able to kind of relate to the object without any help, if that kind of makes sense. I don't think it would make sense. I'm going to go through examples. So example number one here. We're going to use the verb va'ai. And again, va'ai is not the perfective form. It's the imperfective form of that verb. You'll notice there's no suffix of a or ina on the end of that. And therefore, it is intransitive. And by the way, this isn't hard and fast. It's not to say that all perfective verbs are transitive and all imperfective verbs are transitive. Or sorry, I got that backwards. It's not to say that all imperfective verbs are intransitive and all perfective verbs are transitive, but it's a pretty heavy overlap. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to say that it is. So va'ai is an imperfective verb and it's an intransitive verb, meaning it needs a preposition to connect it to the object. So in our sentence here, Sa'o va'ai I le ta'avale. I is our preposition word here. And again, if this is brand new sentence structure to you, there are other videos. Go back to that Samoan language grammar playlist, and you can find verb sentence structures and then come back to this video. So, Sa'o va'ai I le ta'avale is I saw the car. In English, we don't have to say I saw to the car, but in Samoan you do. Because it's an intransitive verb. So that's kind of what the letter I translates to. It almost translates to. So sa'o va'ai I le ta'avale. Now, when we make that verb perfective, we no longer need the preposition to connect it to the object. And by the way, the object in this sentence is ta'avale, which is the car. So the way that we would say that in Samoan is we keep everything the same up until we complete the verb. And make it perfective. So instead of saying sa'o va'ai, we say sa'o va'aya. And again, it changes the meaning of the sentence slightly. It means instead of I saw the car, it's I have seen the car, meaning like you kind of completed that action is how you're referring to it. So sa'o va'aya le ta'avale. And the biggest change here, obviously besides using the perfective form of the verb, is we don't need the preposition anymore. We dropped it. The perfective sentence structure does not require a preposition to connect the action to the object of the action. So the next kind of thing I want to point out here is up until now, we've used a particular sentence structure that uses pronouns. A pronoun, just as a refresher, is I in this case. I is a pronoun. It's not like a regular noun. It's not like the box or the boy. It means me, right? So that's a particular sentence structure in Psalm 1. If we were to get rid of the pronouns and still use the perfected form of va'aya, so in other words, va'aya, there's a slightly different sentence structure formula that we need to follow, besides just dropping the preposition. And I'll talk about that here. So I want to first talk about the intransitive sentence structure and how that looks, and that should be what you've learned up to this point. And then I'll talk about the transitive sentence structure, which will be new in this video. So in this case, instead of saying I saw the car, I'm going to say the boy saw the car. And the way that I'm going to do that in Psalm 1 is by using my tense marker, verb, subject, noun, sentence structure. And again, I've got other videos on that, so I would go back and look at those. So the way that this would go is sa va'ai letama, and that means the boy saw. And then if we want to say the car, in Psalm 1, because this is an imperfective verb, it's going to use intransitive sentence structure. I'm going to have to actually say to the car, just like we did above. So sa va'ai letama ile ta'avale. The boy saw, to the car. Sa va'ai letama ile ta'avale. Again, that's sort of what we know so far. Now that we've introduced perfective verbs and transitive sentence structure, there's a slight difference here. We drop the preposition just like we did above, but we add something new. We add this, what I'm going to call particle e, the letter E. And what e does is it actually marks the subject noun in the transitive sentence structure. And I'll give you an example. So here, when we perfect the verb va'ai and we call it va'aya, this is how the sentence changes. Sa, and by the way, just in case it's not super clear, I am right here in terms of the examples. Okay, so sa va'aya eletama leta'avale. So here, when we're looking at the sentence, notice that the particle a here, let's see, let me just highlight it real quick. Okay, that's the particle a, and it is marking the subject noun. The other noun in the sentence, because basically there's two nouns that come in a row, letama and leta'avale, that come right after another. And the way that we know which one's the subject and which one's the object, it's less about the order that they come in. Like, it's not necessarily that the subject always comes first and the object always comes second, although most often it does. Technically, this letter E, the particle A, it is marking the subject noun. So, sa va'aya eletama leta'avale. You can almost think of the translation of the letter A, of the particle A, to be by. So if I was going to translate this to English, I would say the car was seen by the boy. And that gets a little confusing because in English, we can flip the nouns differently than in Psalm 1. But notice that by is marking the subject noun in this sentence. That's the same way that the particle a marks the subject noun in the Psalm 1 sentence. So that's kind of how I'd look at it. You could actually flip these nouns. You could say sa va'aya leta'avale eletama. And then it would look a lot like the English sentence version. So in that case, we're saying sa va'aya leta'avale. What we're saying with just that, we're saying the car was seen. And we don't necessarily know by who yet, but we're just saying it was seen. And that would be a complete sentence in Psalm 1. We can say sa va'aya leta'avale. The car was seen or was noticed. And then you're still kind of waiting for by who. And that's when you would say eletama. Hopefully that's not super confusing, but again, what I would do is I would say, great, let's add this new formula to your sort of sentence building repertoire. And you can say, hey, when I'm using a perfective verb, in other words, a transitive verb, I'm going to use the transitive sentence structure, meaning I got to mark the person or the thing doing the verb with the particle a. That's the biggest takeaway here. And you'll notice this if you're trying to read a Psalm 1 text, and I would encourage everyone to, by the way, to try and do that. There are Psalm 1 articles out there. You can look at the Talafo, the Psalm 1 newspapers that are online. You can read things that are in Psalm 1, and you'll notice this sentence structure coming out. Or if you are religious and you read scriptures, you can get Psalm 1 versions of the scriptures You can get some of them online, I believe, but if not, you can get them in print fairly easily. So I would look for these sentence structures being manifest, and they are spoken as well. It's a little bit harder to hear because people speak fast and you're still learning, but this is just another sort of sentence structure formula that I would kind of put into your sort of repertoire, if that makes sense. Okay, that being said, I will move on. So for practice, what I would just encourage you to do is practice building sentences using sort of the traditional sentence structure that you've learned up to this point, and then I would flip the verb to a perfective verb, and then I would flip the sentence to using a transitive sentence structure. And this is to just try and get you be able to move back and forth. Think of this flipping as, like I said, if you are an English buff and you think about using passive sentence structure versus active sentence structure, it's kind of the same thing. So you can say the same sentence, it kind of means the same thing, but you're saying it with sort of a different style and a different emphasis. Between passive and active, it's the same thing here. Between using your transitive sentence structure and your intransitive sentence structure. It's not quite the same, but it's a good enough analogy. So with that being said, like I typically try and do, I'll go ahead and pronounce the Samoan verbs. Obviously mention what the meaning is. And it looks like I got a typo in my slide here. This should say English, but I think that should be obvious to you guys. So I'll go through, this is just a few examples. You could add more verbs to this list, and I encourage you to do so. I was just trying to come up with ones that I thought you could probably factor into sentences. So anyway, that being said, I'll go ahead and start from the left and read on down to the right, starting with fau. Fau. Fau is the Samoan verb to build, and the perfective form of this is an irregular verb, and it uses the suffix sia instead of nia or ina or a. So the perfective form of fau is fausia. And again, there's no real easy way for you to have known that. So sometimes you just pick these up. All right, so again, fau and fausia, and they both mean to build. So you can build a building, build a road, build whatever, and that would be the object of those sentences. Okay, ai. Ai hopefully is familiar to you by now, but this is the Samoan verb to eat, and the perfective form can be either aya or aina. And notice that aina isn't like technically using the suffix ina, but it really is. It's just that we're just collapsing it and mushing it together. So instead of saying aina, people are probably going to say aina, but in reality, it's the same. It's just that it's kind of said so fast that it kind of mushes together. And again, ai, aya, aina, they mean to eat. Tu is a pretty common word. It means to put, to place. And then tu'ua is the perfective form of that verb. One thing I'll mention is tu'ua is probably better translated in English to depart, but it comes from the verb tu'u, which is to place and to put. But it's one of those verbs where the meaning slightly changes by making it perfective. Still a good use for our exercise today. I just thought I'd point it out. Fa'ola, fa'ola, fa'ola. Ola means to live. Fa'ola means to make alive or to enliven. And the perfective form of that would be fa'olaina, fa'olaina. Going down to the last verb there, lele. Lele is the Samoan verb to fly. The perfective form of that would be lelea, lelea. This is another one where technically, like a flag waving in the wind is lelea, but it comes from lele. It's kind of like flapping in the wind. So anyway, another way that the perfective form of a verb would kind of get translated a little bit differently in English than the imperfective form, but in reality, it's still very, very much the same verb. It's related. It's just sort of our concepts are a little bit different in English. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Again, I think this one was longer than I'd hoped it would be, but please subscribe, thumbs up, give me a comment if these things are helpful. Again, I'll do my best to kind of keep putting these out as long as people are watching them. And by all means, if you guys have ideas of what else you'd like to see or questions that you have, that'd be great. I'll absolutely take those on. And if there's interest, make a video about it. Thanks, everyone.